Hello, everyone. I'm Jennifer Burrington, and welcome to Smarty Plants, a Minnesota Department of Agriculture podcast that keeps you informed about invasive species affecting our environment and agricultural resources. Have you ever wondered what it takes for a plant to be added to Minnesota's Noxious Weed List, or removed from it? That's what we're digging into today. The Minnesota Department of Agriculture works closely with its Noxious Weed Advisory Committee to take a science-based look at plant species that could threaten Minnesota's landscapes, agriculture, and natural resources. The committee conducts detailed risk assessments and makes recommendations to the Commissioner of Agriculture. Those recommendations can include a listing of species as prohibited eradicate, prohibited control, restricted, or specially regulated, or deciding not to list it at all. Heading into 2026, there were several notable updates. 6 new species were added, 1 species shifted categories, and 2 species of poison ivy were removed from the list. In this episode, we'll talk about what those changes mean, how decisions are made, and why the list continues to evolve. And if you'd like a refresher on the regulatory categories and how plants are classified, be sure to check out Episode 8 of Smarty Plants. Harmful weeds make the list. Joining us today to discuss the updates to the Minnesota Noxious Weed List are Emilie Justen and Jim Calkins. Thank you both for being here.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Emilie Justen graduated from the University of Wisconsin-Madison with a Bachelor of Science in Horticulture. She joined the Peace Corps and served in Guatemala, and then earned her Master of Science in Horticulture from the Iowa State University. Emilie has worked for the MDA for over 12 years, focusing on invasive species and noxious weeds. She enjoys helping people identify plants and figure out how to manage problematic plants. Dr. Jim Calkins is a nursery production and landscape horticulture expert who earned his PhD in horticulture with a minor in plant physiology from the University of Minnesota. He spent 29 years with the University of Minnesota's Department of Horticulture Science, leading teaching, research, and outreach efforts. Since 2012, Jim has served as Regulatory Affairs Manager for the Minnesota Nursery and Landscape Association and as a Research Information Director for the MNLA Foundation. Jim has been deeply involved in Minnesota's noxious weed work for decades, serving on the MDA's Noxious Weed Advisory Committee since 2009, and previously on its predecessor committee. He led the development of Minnesota's science-based plant risk assessment and management protocol, which is still used today to evaluate plants for potential noxious weed listing. He has also served on the advisory committee for the Minnesota Invasive Terrestrial Plants and Pest Centers. As a student and promoter of native ecosystems and as an advocate for sustainable designed landscapes, Jim believes there are no bad plants, only good plants that are sometimes planted in the wrong places. So thanks for joining us today. And so some of these plants that are added or reclassified or delisted from the Minnesota's Noxious Weed List, what should people understand about the purpose behind those changes? Like, why are these put on and moved around or taken off?
I think it's important for people to understand that what the goal is, and the goal is to avoid unnecessary regulation, but still have regulation of problematic plants that are going to cause problems for people or for agriculture or for native ecosystems.
And then, Jim, if you want to tell us, what are those species that were added this year, and then which one changed? And like we mentioned earlier, there were some that were taken off.
Sure. As you mentioned, there were some changes that went into effect at the beginning of this year. And I can quickly go over what those are. Stiltgrass was listed as a prohibited eradicate species, and it's was thought to have been introduced in packing material from Asia, which is kind of interesting. As far as species that were added that are restricted, creeping meadow foxtail was added to the list as native to Eurasia and Africa, and it was introduced for forage and erosion control, but has escaped and become problematic in some parts of the country. Autumn olive, which is a landscape plant potentially, although it hasn't been reliably hardy in Minnesota until recent years. It was native to temperate Asia, and it was intentionally introduced for shelter belts, erosion control, wetland reclamation, wildlife habitat, and as a landscape plant. And then calorie pear, which had been specially regulated for 3 years to allow for a phase-out, now has been moved onto the restricted list, so it can no longer be sold in the state. And then a couple of species were added as specially regulated plants, and that includes 2 species of butterbur, common and giant butterbur, both of which are native to parts of Europe and Asia. And they were introduced as landscape plants. And all of the specially regulated species, by the way, will become restricted in 3 years after a phase-out period, so in 2029. And then the third one that was specially regulated, again, to allow for a phase-out is European or Rowan Mountain ash, which is obviously native to Europe, but also to Russia and northern China. It was introduced as a landscape plant. And then poison ivy was delisted. It was listed as a specially regulated plant, but it was delisted because it's a native plant, and it was determined by the group that people should know about poison ivy, and we really shouldn't be regulating it because it's everywhere in the state and it's native. And then the last changes involved exemptions of cultivars of species that are regulated, and they include some cultivars of winged burning bush, 2 cultivars that are sterile or have low fertility were approved to be grown and sold in the state, and several cultivars of Japanese barberry were also approved such that they could be grown or sold in the state again because they're sterile or have very low fertility.
Thanks. And so, being from the industry, Jim, how much input comes from industry partners and researchers when potential changes are being considered? I mean, we've talked about the variety of membership that is on the Noxious Weed Advisory Council and stuff, and can you give us a little insight on that?
Sure. It's interesting to me, anyways, that historically industry has not generally been well represented in noxious weed evaluations, and that's nationwide. I think Minnesota was a leader in that regard in bringing industry in to help with the evaluation process, and we get lots of information from growers. We get value as far as the monetary value of plants to the state as landscape plants, and those kinds of things are included in the risk assessment and the evaluation of whether a plant should be listed or not. And I guess I could throw a plug in and say that I'm proud of my industry because we have our board has gone along with all of the recommendations, including for many landscape plants that are on the list. At least so far, we've gone along with all of the regulations that have been recommended.
Thanks. Well, that's good to understand. So, with the risk assessment process, it's very rigorous and thorough, and like I said, everybody on the Noxious Weed Advisory Committee participates in these. And what does that process actually look like? Could you kind of walk us through the process, use an example like burning bush?
A risk assessment is a document that is written by a subcommittee of the Noxious Weed Advisory Committee. And this document includes a lot of well-researched information covering a number of different questions with sub-questions about biology of the plant, economic impact of the plant, or how much it might cost growers to stop growing it and not sell it anymore, if it's harmful to the plant or harmful to humans and livestock, environmental impacts. So it covers quite a broad range of questions that are answered and researched. So yeah, it is really rigorous. There are, for an example, like burning bush. There's the process really got started when there was a really large, something like 13-acre infestation of burning bush that was mapped down in southern Minnesota. And at that point, we hadn't started writing a risk assessment for that species yet, but it really pushed the group into looking closely at that species and what environmental impacts there might be from not doing anything and just letting it potentially become the next buckthorn species. So burning bush is a good example of what a species that we hadn't done a risk assessment yet, but knew there could be some impacts from it. And then in addition to just writing an initial risk assessment, there's also a process that species go through for reassessing every few years, or at least looking at seeing if there's new information we might need to add to the risk assessment. And so burning bush just had a new assessment written and completed for that one as well. So that one's gone through a couple different versions of a risk assessment as well. Did you have anything to add to that, Jim?
Sure. From a landscape perspective, obviously, winged burning bush or winged euonymus was a very popular plant. And I expected that we would get a lot of pushback in listing it, but that didn't happen. But since it's been listed in Minnesota and a number of other states, researchers have been working to develop selections or cultivars that are either sterile or have low fertility. And that's pretty new, and it's new for us in Minnesota. And so for the update, its primary function wasn't to determine whether the species should continue to be regulated. It was to look at these low fertility or sterile cultivars and determine if they were safe enough to be exempted. And so that is kind of a new addition to our process, is to review cultivars for potential exemption. And in this case, we determined that, yes, there were several cultivars that we would exempt.
Yeah, and it's good to hear that, burning bush is a lot of people may already have it in their yards and have probably planted it through the years here. And it has very good qualities, and people enjoy it in their yards. And so if we can solve the problem of why it's invasive, and that's with the having either no seeds or low fecundity, that would be great. And it's good to see that because of the restriction, because of being placed on the noxious weed list and it couldn't be sold anymore, they said, well, let's try to develop cultivars that we could use. So it's really good to see that the industry is working with and trying to come up with new cultivars that are able to still be planted and people can enjoy those qualities of that plant that they enjoy, which is probably the color.
And it's one of those plants that we always look for, as part of the review, we say, are there good alternatives?
Yeah.
And for winged euonymus, the answer to that was really there aren't, because it's shade tolerant, it has really great fall color, it's easy to grow, it's a low maintenance plant, and so it's great that we now have some exempted cultivars.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes me very happy because they're quite beautiful. So I'm excited about them. All right, so what happens when there isn't much published research available on these species? You're talking lots of research goes through. You're talking these new industry looks into creating new cultivars. What happens when you can't find a lot of research for your risk assessments that you're doing?
That does happen, and actually a number of species that we're reviewing right now, we're faced with that. And it depends on whether the plant has been actively grown for landscape use, for example, or in agriculture or for other reasons. There's typically going to be more information available for them than something that typically, that's native someplace and hasn't been introduced into the United States yet or North America yet. One example of that is that we often can't find information on whether or not a plant is reproducing naturally by seed in the state. And that's one of the questions that's asked in the protocol is, certainly is it hardy? Can it survive in the state? But then how is it spreading? Is it spreading by seed? And so we're having difficulty finding that information. So we'll keep looking. We may need to say we need to have more research to get the answer to that question. And it gets even a little more complicated than that because what happens in a lab, for example, in germinating seed is going to be different than once the plant's out in the wild because your chances of seed germinating and surviving to become a mature plant in the wild is reduced quite a bit because of competition and other things. So we run into that, and we do the best we can to find information.
So how do you balance ecological harm with what is realistically enforceable and achievable? Because it's a wide range of species that are on the list and a wide range of places where they're going to be found, whether it's in a forest, in a landscape, or in an agricultural field. So if you can kind of answer that, Jim?
Sure. I guess I would use a couple of species that are regulated as examples for that, and one of them is common or European buckthorn and glossy buckthorn, which most people are aware of those species and the harm that they can cause. They were listed as restricted species, which means you can't grow them and sell them in the state primarily, rather than as a prohibited eradicate or a prohibited control species, because they're so widely distributed that listing them as a prohibited eradicate plant just wouldn't be feasible, and the same thing for prohibited control, and these species wouldn't be easy to control. There aren't good ways to control them. So that's the best category that we would put them into to get at least some benefit from regulation. The same thing would be true for burning bush. And in the case of both of these, they're spread by birds, which is one of the primary reasons why they're listed, because they spread very easily and widely because birds are spreading this seed around. So it wouldn't be realistic to put them in a more restrictive category of regulation. We just put them where it's going to have the most effect with the least negative effects.
Yeah, it's hard with buckthorn. If you were to put it on the prohibited eradicate, and you would expect everybody in the whole entire state to eradicate buckthorn out of their yard, and that's a very lofty goal if that were to ever get put on that list. But then there's other plants for example, Palmer amaranth and stuff. You have specific locations and very small populations of these plants that are showing up, and those ones you can eradicate. They're very, very targeted management and identification, and they're not extremely large spreading right away if you target them right away. And that's not something that's widespread already in the state. So you guys do a lot of research and a lot of discussion on where they should place and where they should go. It's not just a quick vote in a half-hour meeting, yes or no, for this one on this list. So it's good to hear that there's lots of thought going into it.
Mm-hmm.
When we listed buckthorn, again, we weren't going to make it a prohibited eradicate because it's everywhere. But the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board basically said if you did that, it would bust our budget. We wouldn't all of our money would go into that.
Yep, there's a lot of buckthorn,
mm-hmm.
especially in urban areas, because it used to be planted as a lot of hedges and things like that, and a lot of people used to have it in their yards, and now everybody's trying to get rid of it slowly but surely. If you want more information on how to get rid of buckthorn, we do have a podcast on that with a project on Cover It Up. So one of the more complex issues this year involved Japanese barberry cultivars. Is cultivar regulation more complicated than regulating a species, Emilie?
Yeah, it is. When we regulate a species, all other cultivars are also regulated. Or, for example, for anything on the eradicate list, like the golden honeysuckle vine, there are couple cultivars of that out there. But everything in Minnesota is on the eradicate list, so all the golden honeysuckle vine species and any cultivars of that would not be available for sale. You'd have to get rid of it on your property. And with Japanese barberry too, it's already a complicated regulation because currently there are 20-odd cultivars that are prohibited from sale. And now we have a handful of cultivars that are exempt from being banned from sale, so they're available for sale. And there's a phase-out period in addition to that. So Japanese cultivar or Japanese barberry is a complicated regulation already. And so trying to regulate these cultivars that have come out that are low seeding and low fecund are hopefully in a few years that'll be easier and less complicated. But at this point right now, yeah, it's kind of a complex issue.
I guess I'd add to that it's, as Emilie said, it's easy to regulate a species and any hybrids that include that species as a parent or named cultivars. That's just easy because you're regulating everything. When you exempt some, it becomes confusing for people. It's not as clear. Obviously, industry is happy about that when they can grow things, again, because Japanese barberry was a very popular plant and there are hundreds of named cultivars. And it gets more complicated when you add in trade names. And some people may not be familiar with that, but when plants are named scientifically, you include a cultivar name as part of the scientific name. Now we also have trademark names, which are owned by the company or the grower who owns rights to that plant. And those are typically the names now that are used by people just to refer to the plant generally, because the cultivar names that are given now are nonsensical names. So the public gets confused about cultivar names and trademark names and all the rest of that. So it just adds more complication and confusion.
So with these newly listed species, like stiltgrass, some of them are not yet documented in Minnesota. So why add it to the list if isn't currently a problem here?
In these cases, they have been documented as being problems in other states, either with similar climates to Minnesota or nearby. And so they're enough of a threat to other states that we wanted to preemptively make sure that if it does show up, then we could react pretty quickly to it. And Palmer's a good example of that. That was listed before it was in the state, and then as soon as it was confirmed, then we were able to have a lot of work get done on it pretty quickly to make sure that it wouldn't spread. And then, like stiltgrass, it is pretty close by to Minnesota. There's a population of it by La Crosse, Wisconsin, and so it could show up here. I don't think it's unreasonable to think that it could survive here pretty easily as well. We've had a few false reports of it, but we haven't had any confirmations of it yet. But that's another one that we'd want to make sure to be able to react to pretty quickly if we confirm it in the state as well.
I guess I would add to that and note that this is a question that comes up during the discussions of the Noxious Weed Advisory Committee, often related to the length of our list, is that we have some people who are concerned that the list is getting too long, and we have other people who believe that, if it's a problem plant, it should be put on the list, and that keeping the list short shouldn't be a priority. But again, as Emilie was saying, if we know it's going to survive, has potential to survive here and become a problem, we want to be ahead of the game and get it listed so we're ready when it does show up. And then people are looking for it as well.
Yeah, and that's a lot of, like Emilie was saying, that we've had a bunch of reports in about stiltgrass, which have come back negative. But if you ever do see one of these a plant someplace in the state that you think may possibly be one that is on the noxious weed list, you can always report it to the MDA's Report a Pest hotline, which you can visit the website. It would be www.mda.state.mn.us/ and this is all one word, report a pest. And then you can go on there and it'll give you a bunch of options to fill out our form or an email address that you can send in pictures, the location, and things like that. So if you're ever out and about, whether it's on state property, your own property, even in your backyard, if you happen to see something, by all means, please take a picture of it and let us know where it is. And Emilie will be happily take a look at those pictures and help identify it. Because I triage all the reports that come in, and all the weed ones, all the plants go to Emilie.
Mm-hmm.
So we do have that option. So as people are learning about all of these different plants that are on the noxious weed list. So one of the plants, poison ivy, was removed from the list. So if you happen to see poison ivy, you don't have to let us know. It's not on the list anymore. But possibly the first species to be delisted. Why was that decision made? And does this mean that the plant is no longer harmful?
Interestingly, poison ivy, which we have 2 native species in the state, most people don't know that, has had an interesting history as far as regulation in Minnesota is concerned. It used to be a prohibited eradicate species, which meant that it had to be eradicated everywhere where it was growing in the state, including, for example, in the middle of Itasca State Park. It's a native species, and it's a native species that is important to wildlife, including over 50 species of birds that feed on the seeds. So it's a very important part of an ecosystem across the state. So the primary issue is yes, it's harmful to some people and can be very bad for some people. So in our more recent discussions, I should say that it was moved from prohibited eradicate to specially regulated, which meant that it had to only be eradicated in areas where people would likely get into it very easily, like along a trail or something like that. And it's been there for a while now. But in more recent discussions, we've determined, again, because of its importance as a native plant and our belief that everybody in Minnesota, because it's a native plant that's everywhere, should know what it looks like and be able to stay away from it, that we would delist it because of its importance. And it will still be voluntarily managed by the DNR and others in places where people are going to likely get into it just from the perspective of protecting people from it. So I think the outcome, is the best outcome for that plant, and it's still going to be managed where there's going to be an issue for people.
Yeah, and I was going to point that out, too, that it was still going to be managed no matter what, even though it wouldn't be on the noxious weed list. So, and it wasn't – the category it was in wasn't really an enforceable category either, so it was kind of sitting there as a noxious weed, but not really a noxious weed.
Yeah, it's more of a kind of like a best management while you're out hiking. Keep an eye out for just like a practice. Keep your eye out for it. Look for leaves of 3, things like that. So more of the educating everybody on how to identify it and stay away from it. Again, with other plant species that are harmful, that are not on the list or something when then people are out walking around. So, yeah. Well, that's good. One off the list, and then 6 other ones on the list this year. So, what is the most important takeaway from this year's changes to the noxious weed list? We've talked about the different species that were added, some that were changed, some that were removed. So, kind of what would you like to give listeners from the updates from this year?
I think a takeaway from my perspective, being one of the people that works on risk assessments over the year, is that the group really does work hard and does think through and does a lot of research on all of these risk assessments. And so there's a lot of work that goes into them. We don't take the decisions lightly to either put a species on the list or take one off. And there are a lot of discussions within our listing group, and then there's discussions within our noxious weed advisory group, and they all talk to their stakeholders and constituents about these changes too. So there's a lot of work and decisions and thought that goes into all of these. And so I think that's, for me, one of the big takeaways is that the noxious weed list may be long, but it's I don't know. We do think they're important, I guess.
I would agree with everything that Emilie just said. I would add to that, and again, from an industry perspective, I think the discussions that the Noxious Weed Advisory Committee has had about potentially exempting cultivars is an important step for us, and I think it's been a real educational exercise for the committee too, to understand what it means for a plant to truly be sterile or to have a low level of fertility, and what level of fertility would be allowable or considered safe. So I think those were important discussions to have. And again, as Emilie said, that it's, again, a rigorous process, and deciding to exempt something, a lot of thought goes into that before we would recommend that to the Commissioner of Agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and as an outsider kind of perspective on it, also the fact that industry and regulators can work together and creating those sterile cultivars and everything. And because you said, like, everybody, there's qualities to that plant that are very good, but just the seed, they just needed to not have seed, and then it would then it would be really great and to have this beautiful plant. So it's nice to see that there are options, and there is research that goes into it, and development of new cultivars, and really working to understand those plants better. So that's something that I took away from it too, is that I can have those beautiful red burning bush in the fall,
Mm-hmm.
have one of the cultivars that is sterile. So, well, great. If listeners remember just one thing about the Noxious Weed List in particular, what would you want it to be?
I can start off with that one. I would say that it's important to recognize that there's a process for the listing of species, and it's a rigorous science-based process. So decisions are not being made lightly, and that the ultimate goal of that process is to determine if there are plants that are harmful to people directly, or to livestock, to agriculture, and to native ecosystems. And if they are, to find the best way to regulate them to reduce or eliminate that harm if we can do that. So I think that's the thing to keep in mind, is that it's a very rigorous science-based process that has the goal of protecting Minnesotans and the native ecosystems in the state as well. There is politics involved. We go through the whole process, and then we have to vote, and the commissioner has to make a decision, and politics often come into that. But that's fine. I think that's an important part of the process.
Yeah, we didn't talk about that, the politics part of it. But yeah, everything Jim said. And then I get a lot of calls from people over the year too, just from residents in Minnesota. And sometimes it can, who maybe just discovered that there is a noxious weed list. And sometimes it can be overwhelming to first see the list and see that there's so many species, and then to realize that they have maybe something like knotweed on their property. And so it's one of the things that I think about, just what the noxious weed list is that it's important, but you're probably unlikely to have even one of these species on your property. You might have one, you might have two, maybe, but you're not going to have all 60 of these on your property. So it might seem overwhelming at first, but in most cases it's pretty manageable. And there's, you can take small steps to manage them if you have one, but it's not the end of the world to have a noxious weed on your property either.
Yeah, and then there's some great resources on our website also that you guys have a ton of pictures on how to identify all of these different species that are on the list. And then, like I mentioned earlier, too, like if you happen to see a plant that you think might be on the noxious weed list, could be one of the species, please, by all means, take a picture of it. Take a few pictures of the leaves, the flowers, any seeds, fruits, anything that you see on it, and send it in to our report a pest. And just identification is key into figuring out, is it the invasive one or not? And if it is, then you can take the next step and figure out, okay, what is the management that I need to do on this? Well, thank you, Emilie and Jim, for both sharing your insights and helping us better understand how Minnesota's noxious weed list evolves. If you'd like to learn more about this year's updates or explore the full Minnesota Noxious Weed List, visit the Minnesota Department of Agriculture's website at www.mda.state.mn.us. This has been Smarty Plants, a podcast from the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. Our producer is Brittany Ravel and Sadie Anderson. Our editor is Larry Schumacher, and I have been your host. You can learn more about pests and other invasive species that affect our environment online, and while you head to our website, we'll be working on the next episode of Smarty Plants. See you there.